G'day guys, in this video series I'm going to be talking to you about the World Team Championships of Warhammer 40k from the perspective of the captain of and World Eaters player for Team Australia. We're going to dig into the preparation for the event, how that all went down and what our team strategy was. We're going to dig into the War Masters singles event, we're going to talk about my list in detail, and we're also going to break down every round, every game that we played into every other opponent from nations all around the world. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the World Team Championships and Team Australia, this video series is for you. Let's get into it.
Look for the blood god.
Alrighty guys, the first thing that I want to talk to you about is the WTC itself and explain what it is for those of you who don't know, and then also talk a little bit about the pros and cons of Team 40k and why it inspires so much passion from people all around the globe. So the WTC is the World Team Championships, formerly known as the ETC or the European Team Championships, and it's basically the 40k Olympics is the best way to describe it. And what happens is every nation gets to send a team of 8 players to participate in Team 40k against other nations and the best players that they're able to muster. So it's an absolutely fantastic opportunity to express your national pride whilst playing with your mates and enjoying this game that we know and love at the highest level of competitive 40k. It's an absolutely brutal tournament because every single player that you're playing against is one of the best in their country. It's not like a local RTT or a local GT where you'd be playing against some more casual players. Everybody that you play is the absolute cream of the crop, and it's an absolutely exhilarating experience. It's so much fun. I also want to note here is that some of the games that I played, which we'll go into in detail later in this series, were some of the most extremely high levels of sportsmanship and camaraderie that I've ever seen. There's a real sense that you're there to represent your nation, not just yourself, and as a result, the amount of goodwill that is expressed by players is absolutely phenomenal. So it's like the most intense 40k you'll ever play, but against somebody who's behaving like your best mate. It's really, really fantastic institution. The tournament organizers do a fantastic job. The referee team do a great job. And it's an absolute staple in my calendar now that I've gone. And I highly recommend looking into it and getting involved yourself. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about Teams 40k because it's somewhat newish and it's increasing in popularity. So Teams 40k, the way it works is basically you still play a one-on-one game, and it's still just your 2,000 points match play, just exactly the same as what you would play in a singles event. However, what you do is you have 8 players on your team, 8 players on their team. You do a little pairings exercise to figure out who's going to be playing against who, and then all those people separate off and play their games. And then basically what you do is you get an amalgam of your scores to see which nation was able to score more points across their players against the other nation. One of the interesting things about WTC that I really like is they use a 0 to 20 battle point differential scoring system. So basically what that means is, normal tournament you're going to get 0 to 100 of your victory points, and so is your opponent, and then whoever gets more wins. However, what they do with the WTC is you compare the difference between your score and your opponent's score to get a score out of 0 to 20. So if you draw and you both get the same score, you're going to get a 10-point draw. So you get 10 points, they get 10 points. However, if you beat them by like 30 points, so say you get 70 points and they get 40 points, that difference of, whatever the difference is, gets translated into a differential. So that might be a 16 to 4. And the idea here is that your game against your opponent is always going to add up to a total of 20. Because if you draw, you both get 10. If you beat them pretty hard, you're going to get a 16, they might get a 4. Or you might get an 18 and they get a 2. Or you might get a 13 and they get a 7. But either way, the total points available in that game add up to 20. Which means that the total points that any team can score is 160. Because you've got 8 players, all of which can score a maximum of 20. And basically, the more points you score, the less points your opponent's team is going to score. And that's a really, really cool way of incentivizing a very specific type of play. Because what this means is that every victory point that you get is worth something because it's going to contribute to your team's score. So even if you're losing the game, you want to play hard and you want to try to get those points, which means nobody gives up, nobody concedes, nobody rolls over. everybody's scrapping for points at the bottom there. It also means that any big plays that you can do to secure really big victory points are of high value, because you might have somebody else on your team who's losing their game, so you need to win your game by a big margin in order to bring the win back for the team. So that's a really fascinating way that this all sort of pans out and this all works. And one of the other things that it does is it actually incentivizes you to interact with your opponent. You know, in a singles one where it's just try to get 100 points, doesn't matter what your opponent does, as long as you get your 100 points, you win. That doesn't work at WTC. You can't just design a list that's going to max all of its secondaries and score decent on primary. If you're not stopping your opponent from scoring their victory points and they also score really high, you might win the game, but it might only be an 11-9 win. Whereas you design a list that's going to simultaneously score all of its stuff, but also prevent your opponent from scoring their objectives, prevent your opponent from being on those primary objectives, then you're going to get a bigger differential win, which is going to be more impactful for your team. And I absolutely love this. I wish more events, even singles events, adopted this, because it incentivizes you to not only play a game where you're scoring your stuff, but actually actively interact with your opponents. So that's a really cool way that they do the scoring, and it really does unlock a different level of play. It's not enough to just score your points. You need to be interacting with your opponents. So that's one of the other really fascinating things about the WTC. This year it was held in Mechelen in Belgium, which is an absolutely ripper of a little city. It's very old, it's very ancient. If you want to check out the city, the Risky Rollers over on their YouTube channel, I'll put some links in the description below. They did a really good series of vlogs where they basically every morning and every night they would record, you know, just little bits and pieces around the town, interviews with players, talking about, you know, the antics and the prep that we were doing and how we were doing all of that. So I'll chuck a link to their vlog series. Absolutely funny watch. It's really, really cool. And then also we did a bunch of live stuff over on the Team Australia Facebook page. So if you want a little bit more of the experience, check that sort of stuff out. But yeah, it's a ripper little city. It's very ancient. There's lots of cathedrals and really, really cool stuff. And it's also, you know, really close to the Brussels airport. So it's a fantastic venue. It's been at that venue for the last 3 years. But going forward in the coming years, it's going to be held in Austria most likely. So that's going to be a really interesting and exciting change. But yeah, basically it's always in Europe, because obviously that's convenient for the vast majority of the nations, because they're all sort of clustered around there. Unfortunately, places like Australia and New Zealand, we've got a 24-hour flight to get there, which is a bit of an ordeal, but it's also part of the experience for us. I think that it's part of what makes it such an exciting trip, is that we're putting in a lot just to be able to attend. A couple other things to note on the WTC is they have a tier system for nations, where basically you get a tier designation based on your historic performance. And the idea here is to separate the teams that have really strong players and really strong results versus the teams that have less strong players or less experienced players. And then based on your tier designation, the first 3 rounds are set up as a pod. So basically what's going to happen is there's going to be 4 people in a pod. You're going to have one of the tier 1 nations, one of the tier 2 nations, one of the tier 3, and one of the tier 4. And the idea here is it means that the first 3 rounds of the event, no tier 1 nation is going to have to verse another tier 1 nation. And the idea here is that the last thing you want is to have 2 of the top nations randomly paired into each other at the start of the event, and then have one of them knock the other one out of contention from the podium, have one of them really upset the other one, hurt the morale. Like, you want to make sure that the way that the pairings are done is to result in a really climactic end where you have top nations fighting off for the win. You don't want to have that happen early in the event. So the pod phase, you have one of each tier, and then basically they all verse each other as a sort of a round robin. And then after those first 3 rounds, it breaks off into Swiss pairing system, which is what you'd expect from, you know, your standard singles event where the top person plays the next plays the next, so on and so forth. So it follows a more traditional tournament format after that. And that's a really, really cool way of running the event. It's a lot of fun, and it's 7 rounds in total. So the first 3 rounds, you've got your pod phase, and then it breaks off into Swiss for the rest of the event. The other thing that's worth noting is they're 4-hour rounds of Warhammer 40k, which is absolutely fantastic because it means there's almost 0 chance of there being clock issues. You know, you've got 4 hours to play a game of 40k. That's plenty of time. and it allows you to spend a little bit more time thinking about what you're doing and putting that focus into making sure you don't forget things, you make the right decisions, you go over everything twice, you know, do your scoring accurately, all those sorts of things. So really, really relaxed, you know, in terms of time pressure. And it's only 2 games per day, which means you don't get burnt out and exhausted, even though you're playing some of the most intense 40k across the span of an entire week. It still gives you plenty of downtime to decompress after each game, get some food, relax before playing the next game, and then at the end of the day, you're not fully exhausted because you've only played 2 games. So it's absolutely fantastic format in that regard. And the pod phase this year, Team Australia was a tier 1 nation, which meant we didn't have any other tier 1 nations in our pod. And I'll go through the pod phase in a little bit more detail later in this video series. But that's basically the way the event is structured. One more thing I want to talk about before we get into the specifics of Team Australia, and I'll introduce all of the players and what factions they played and all those sorts of things, is just a real brief recap of why Team 40k is so fantastic. I've already covered on the way that the pairings works, which is really cool. I've already covered on the way that the scoring works with the, you know, the differential scoring and what that does practically in the game, you know, allowing people to play that sort of play style. One of the other really important things about Team 40k is it actually unlocks a lot of really, really cool armies. Because if you're playing a singles event, you basically need to write an army list that can beat anything. You know, it doesn't have to be able to smash everything, but it has to be able to beat anything, because you don't know who your opponent's going to be. So you need to write a list and you're like, okay, I can beat Necrons, I can beat Sisters, I can beat Blood Angels, I can beat Tau, I can beat Eldar, you know, I can beat MSU Eldar, or I can beat Dread Knights, Grey Knight spam. You know, your list needs to be able to function in both of those areas if you're planning to win a singles event. Whereas in a teams event, one of the best parts is that you have a little bit of agency over who you play. And the way that works is basically each team's going to have their 8 lists. At the start, you're both going to simultaneously put up a face down card which has one of your lists on it, and then reveal them simultaneously. And then you're going to be able to put 2 attackers into their defender, and they put 2 attackers into your defender, and then you select from those attackers. So we might put up the World Eaters, they might put in their Tau and their Grey Knights, and then I can select if I want to verse Tau or Grey Knights. So this pairings exercise actually gives you a very large degree of agency over who you're going to play, and more importantly, who you are not going to play. Because if you're put up, you can avoid certain matchups, right? And what that does is that unlocks a whole ton of different armies that you wouldn't even fathom taking to a singles event, but you can get away with taking them to a teams event. You know, it might be something where it's a really heavy skew around Chaos Space Marine bikes. And it's like they're super vulnerable to 3 damage weapons with a high armor piercing value because they don't have an invulnerable save, they don't have a feel no pain, you know. But if you write that list for a teams event, you can just look at the lineup of all the lists the opposing team has, figure out which ones have 3 damage higher AP weaponry, and avoid them. And that way you're going to get better results with that Chaos Space Marine bikes list than you would have otherwise got. Or it might be you run a real MSU style list, and you'd be like, cool, I'm super vulnerable to things like Chaos Knights because they have lots of, you know, discretionary shooting, but I'm really, really strong into things like Oath of Moment that really nail down on one target, because I don't have one valuable target. I've got lots and lots of like Venoms with Scourges and all that sort of stuff. You know, you can go, cool, I don't really care if they have Oath of Moment. So you can design a list with a specific strength and weakness, and then you can bring that and use the pairings exercise to navigate around those strengths and weaknesses, which really unlocks some really janky and really cool lists. Things like Chaos Knights that struggle in singles because there's a lot of armies that can kill them. They thrive in teams events because they can avoid those things that have lots of anti-tank weaponry, and they can just run through things that don't have effective answers for bulk toughness 10 3-up save models. So that's one of the really fascinating parts about teams events. And if you look through the lists, I'll chuck a BCP link in for all of the lists from WTC. You'll see some truly wild stuff, some stuff that you'd be like, who would ever think to bring that? Well, WTC facilitates that. And one of the last great things about teams events that I will touch on is that everything, every single point you get matters, right? There's no individual wins or losses. There's your team winning or your team losing. So there was rounds where we had players on our team bring back 0 victory points. They got absolutely put in the dirt, but we won the round. And as a result, they don't feel so bad because they won the round. And then there's other rounds where you do absolutely fantastically, you crush your opponent, but we lose the round. And again, you don't feel so bad because you crushed your game. So it really insulates those feel bad moments where you go, cool, if I lose but my team wins, I feel good. If I win but my team loses, I feel good. So the only scenario where you feel bad, if you lose but your team loses, you don't even really feel that bad because chances are if you lost and your team lost, multiple people on your team lost. So it's not really your fault. Everybody sort of feels, a little bit down, but you're like, well, at least it wasn't just me. Whereas in a singles event, if you lose, it's just you. There's no responsibility to be shared. So you've got all of these different scenarios and all of them feel good, and you've got your teammates backing you up and pumping you up and making you feel good, and it's absolutely fantastic environment to play Warhammer 40k, as opposed to the singles event where it's just hyper focused on you, your list, your performance. Everybody in the room is an adversary that you need to beat, whereas when you're playing teams 40k, you've got a squad of people with you and you're working together. Absolutely fantastic. And you also get to work with some of the top minds in your nation on developing lists and putting them together. So it's so much fun. I love Teams 40k, whether it be on a local level, 5-man teams events, or whether it be all the way up to the national level with the 8-man teams. It's an absolutely fantastic way to play Warhammer 40k. So if you want to get involved in your Teams 40k, check out your local Facebook groups or whatever. Try and get involved. If you see a Teams event put up on a Facebook page or whatever, hit up the TO and just be like, hey, I want to play, but I don't have a team. If there's any teams looking for an extra player, let me know, and I'll jump on their team. It's a great way to make friends. It's a great way to get introduced into Teams 40k, and trust me, you will never look back, up until the point where you might even end up on your national team. Even as a coach, that's one of the other things worth noting about Teams events, is we often bring coaches with us. These are people who are there to help clean the board, get the tables set up, bring people water, and help communicate throughout the round, let people know what's happening. Because there are some situations where if the rest of your team are losing their games and it's looking like your team is likely to lose the round, you can start making more risky plays, you can start doing really interesting stuff. Whereas if it's looking like you're going to win the round, you can play really conservatively and just stick to your score and not try any risks. So there's a lot of stuff that the coaches can do and facilitate, which is absolutely fantastic. And also one of the things that our coaches did this year was they were our culture officers. So we had, not only did we have coaches doing live streams throughout the round, updating everybody at home, but we also had them making platters with all of Australian classic foods like Tim Tams and fairy bread and shapes and caramello koalas and all sorts of snacks, going around handing them out to people, sharing our culture with them. And other nations were doing a very similar thing, which was so cool, and it really, really did bring that national spirit into the event. And that's something that's only really achievable in Teams events. So yeah, I think that's enough talking about Teams events. Now let's talk a little bit about Team Australia, for which I was the captain this year. Now, Team Australia, we have some interesting methods in which we select our players. Part of the challenge with Team Australia is that Australia as a nation is so massive. The landmass is so huge, and all of our cities are 5 to 6 hours on an airplane apart. So we don't spend a lot of time interacting across the states, which is a challenge because we've got really good players dotted around all around the country. So we do have our national championships, which is called the Australia and New Zealand Team Championships, and it's a mirror version of the WTC, but limited to each state in Australia sends a team of their 8 best players, and then New Zealand, North and South Island, they send their 8 best players, and we basically have a mini WTC hosted internally in Australia. And that's a really good opportunity for players from other states that otherwise would never interact to get to know each other and to meet each other. So we use that as a place to foster WTC talent. And then also we have, a bunch of singles events, majors throughout the year that people will tend to travel for. But it is one of our challenges. So that's one of the things that we have to navigate as a captain when selecting the team, is making sure that I don't just select the best 8 people from Victoria, which is my home state, but making sure that I'm inviting and encouraging people from all around the country to participate. Yeah, one of the other challenges, of course, is that we're so far away from Europe that it's a very, very expensive trip. So we have some real rock star players that can't financially justify a week in Europe to play Warhammer. You know, they might have family commitments, they might have financial burdens, they might have all kinds of reasons, health reasons, that they can't justify traveling to Europe. And that's another one that really holds Australia back and makes it very difficult for us to wield the strongest possible team that we can. However, this year we did an absolutely stellar job, in my opinion, of getting together a diverse range of players from all around Australia and performing particularly well. So let's have a look at the people on our team and what factions they played and how their sort of general inclusion was, arrived at. So the first player that was selected for Team Australia this year was the one and only Matt Morrisoli. And basically, the previous year, all of the players from the previous year decided that they were going to take a year's break. They were tired, they'd played multiple WTCs back to back, and they were exhausted, so they decided they were going to take a year's break, and captaincy was handed to me. I was a coach in the previous year, and I was keen to go again. So captaincy was handed to me, which was a way of keeping that continuation year on year instead of throwing it out to the rest of the nation to have a crack at it. We're like, well, hang on, if we can keep somebody within the current team captain, that way we get to keep that continuation, keep the relationships with the referees and the other captains and the other players, all that sort of stuff. So I took captaincy, and at that point, all of the previous year's players had stepped down. So I was like, cool, I'm going to find 8 new players. And the first one that I was able to convince to come back was Matt Morrisoli. And he's somebody who's a WTC veteran. He's been to a ton of these events and always performs really, really well. And basically, long story short, we were at a singles event, the Oceanic Championships, and there was a water fountain in a lagoon inside the venue, this really, really cool bar called Moondog World. And we got paired, in their first round we had a bye round due to the number of players and the number of rounds. They basically had a number of players had to sit out the first round. So me and Matt were ones that had to sit out. We went over to the bar. We were getting cocktails. There was a part where I ordered a jug. They asked me how many glasses I wanted for my jug, and I said, just chuck a straw in it, mate. And they just chucked a straw in it. So I'm walking away and I'm just drinking these jugs of cocktails. By the time it got to lunch, I was absolutely drunk. It was really, really bad, but it was a lot of fun. And Matt Morrisoli issued me a dare. He basically said that if I went over and sat on this water fountain in the middle of the lagoon, he would come and play for Team Australia for the WTC. So I was like, well, he's one of the best players in the country. It's my responsibility to get the best players in the country to participate in the event. So I guess I've got to go sit on this fountain. So I'll chuck some footage up now of just how ridiculous this scenario played out. But yes, so now fountain's been sat on. Matt Morrisoli is on board to play for the WTC. So we've got one player locked in. Then Jeremy Martino, he was one of the players from previous years. He's the guy that does all of our pairings work. He's an absolute stellar rock star of a player. And he was likely to take a year's break because he had a child recently. However, he was able to finagle a little bit of extra leave and some favor with his partner in order to get him to be able to play again. So now we've got Matt Morrisoli and Jeremy Martino playing for the WTC for Team Australia, which means we've got a real strong start when you include me as a player as well. That's 3 Victorians, really, really powerful way to start out building a team. We then realized quickly that it was looking like a potential boys club. We didn't want to just include all Victorians. So we reached out to the captain of the Western Australian 40k team for the Australian New Zealand Team Championships, Lockie Rigg. He's an absolute weapon. He participated in the Warhammer World Championships in Atlanta in the previous year, performed really, really well, beat some very notable players, and the Western Australian team is one of the strongest teams in Australia. It often comes second or third in the Australian New Zealand Team Championship. So there's a lot of really strong players in Western Australia, and Lockie Rigg as their captain is one of the best, right? So we got him, we roped him in. Then we asked his opinion on who he felt was some of the strongest people in Western Australia, because we wanted to make sure that we were including everybody, but at the same time, as Victorians, we didn't have a great deal of information about who was going to be the strongest. So we reached out to Lockie, and he basically put forward a proposal for who he would like to take. And along with him, he brought Jordan Beresford, who was our Blood Angels player this year. Blood Angels player at ANZTC. He played Space Wolves for us this year. And Callum German, who brought the Tau this year. So now we've got me on the World Leaders, Matt Morosoli on Chaos Space Marines, Jeremy Martino on Thousand Suns. It's a very chaotic Victorian showing. Then we had Lockie Rigg on the Grey Knights, Callum on Tau, and Jordan on Space Wolves. So that's 6 players. Then we started looking around at who else has applied for the team that we can bring in. Unfortunately, there were not a great deal of Queenslanders that had applied this year. A lot of them took a year off, which is a lot of people from the previous year, which is totally understandable. There wasn't a great deal of New South Wales applicants either. So what we did is we brought another Victorian, Reese Cunningham, who's one of the people who is absolutely dominating the Victorian tournament scene right now and regularly puts up really challenging games for Jeremy, Matt, and myself. So it felt wrong to not include him, given that he is often beating people that are on the team. So we brought in Reese Cunningham, and then we also brought in Josh Brody from New South Wales, who's one of the regulars for the New South Wales team for the ANZTC. He's an absolute weapon as well, and he's a long-standing member. We've known him for 6 years, and he always puts up a really strong fight. Very talented player. So we've got him on the Necrons, and then Reese Cunningham took the Sisters of Battle. And that rounds out the player lineup for Team Australia for the WTC 2024. And then basically we looked at it and we're like, well, what we want is some coaches in addition. We want people that are going to be able to help the team out to perform as best as we possibly can. So what we did is we roped in Adam Batista from Western Australia. We thought it was really important to include somebody in Western Australia that can help out the Western Australian lads from the perspective of a coach, and somebody that is going to have a relationship with them, so when we are in Europe and they need something, they have somebody that they have a relationship with that they can count on to help them out. So we asked them, they basically got carte blanche to pick whoever they wanted as their coach, and they picked Adam Batista. Then we also had Oliver Johnson, who's one of the Queensland representatives. We wanted somebody from Queensland. We really wanted to make sure that we were trying to, keep all of the states represented as best as we possibly could. And Oliver is also an analytic mastermind. He does some really, really interesting stuff when analyzing results and the meta and that sort of stuff. So we wanted to include him, and he was our primary score communicator. He was the one that during the event would go between players and be like, okay, so-and-so looks like they're going down by this many points. This is what's happening here. Is there anything you can do to scrouch an extra 2 or 3 victory points? And analyzing the team's overall performance and then pulling the various levers to make sure that we were getting those results. I trusted Ollie to be able to sort of come up with those calculations and make those decisions independently, and he did an absolutely fantastic job. He also did a lot of work analyzing the meta in the lead up to the event, which was really, really helpful when it came to selecting our lists and that sort of thing. Then we brought 2 more coaches, and this was Dalton Nugent and Lawrence Gutierrez from the Risky Rollers. Now, these guys are absolute legends. They've been coaches and players on Team Victoria several years in a row, so they're competent people, they know what they're doing, and they have a deep understanding of the coach role and what we need from that role. And they also have a YouTube channel, Risky Rollers, that does absolutely fantastic content. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to bring them on board so that they could not only support the team from that coach's perspective, but also navigate the social media element. So updating people back at home with graphics and videos, whilst also doing vlogs and keeping everybody involved and keeping everybody in the loop. So that's why they were involved. Dalton was designated as our head coach, and his responsibility was to make sure that all the other coaches were doing what they needed to do, had the tools they needed, and also had an understanding of the rules about how coaches are to behave at the event to make sure that we didn't have any infringements or any challenges whatsoever. Lawrence's role was largely to help out Dalton with the graphics and the social media stuff, and also operate as our culture officer. He was the one making the fairy bread and Tim Tams and making the spread and all those sorts of things. So that was the general sort of lineup for Team Australia for the World Team Championships this year past, and it was an absolutely ripper of a team. We will go through the results later in this series as we go through each round and we talk about who got paired into who and how those games went. But it's safe to say that I'm deeply proud of every single person on the team. Everybody performed, whether it be coaches or players, as expected and did really, really well, or better than expected in some cases. And we all blended together and meshed really, really well as a solid unit. I'm so proud of the boys. And yeah, I'm very happy with what we've achieved, and I'm looking forward to 2025. Alrighty guys, that rounds out this first video in this video series on the World Team Championships. I've got plenty of content to cover here, details about my list and the crazy ideas that we came up with, details on each round that we played, some conclusions and takeaways from the event, some really, really interesting stuff there. So bear all that in mind, and I look forward to keeping you guys up to date and chatting to you guys in the next one. Thanks for tuning in, and if you want to learn more, check out the Team Australia website, teamoz40k.com. There's some really, really cool information there. I'll chuck a link in the description below. And as I said, if you want to check out the antics that we got up to whilst we were over there, check out riskyrollers.com. They have a bunch of information there, and you can also check out the Risky Rollers on YouTube for all of those updates. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
One for the Blood God.